Before imperialism in Africa, the residents who called it home were able to follow their inveterate place rules and customs and survive off the land. There were mainly tribes or kingdoms scattered throughout Africa, which were based on the principles of communalism. This system was built around the idea that allegiance to one own ethnic group rather than a society as a whole was required to follow. There were main rulers in each tribe called chiefs, who overlooked the decisions being made each day and dealt with the issues that arose. Before the start of imperialism, European power was limited and only about 10% of Africa was controlled by European countries. As business owners in Europe looked for new money-making schemes, they saw the inferior African continent as a gold mine. As people started traveling down to exploit the African resources, other European countries wanted to get in on the action, and that is how the scramble for Africa began. As the 20th century approached, European countries had already possessed various advancements in many of the medical, scientific, and societal fields. They believed that they were superior over anyone they came in contact with, and that is exactly how they viewed the African people. They wanted to take them over and take their land, but before they could, they had to overcome the hurdles Africa set for them. The most coveted locations in Africa were the ones that had a bounty of natural resources to plunder, and one of the most gold and diamond-rich countries in Africa was named the Gold Coast. Present-day Ghana is a mining country which holds plenty of gold and diamonds that could make anyone rich. The Portuguese were the first to discover this prized space and built forts around the coastline. They also came in contact with the local African tribe called the Ashanti, who were able to access gold from the interior and happy to supply their defeated slaves to aid the new Europeans in their quest. This quickly caught the attention of the British, and they soon came to the Gold Coast to get a piece of the action. They built a series of fortresses, and their strongest was placed at Cape Coast. The Dutch soon came to the Gold Coast and wanted a piece of their profits too. The British and Dutch ran the Portuguese out of the country, and they were frequently at war with one another over control of the Gold Coast. The Dutch were able to destroy all of Britain's fortresses except for the British's largest one, placed at the Cape Coast. The Treaty of Breda confirmed Dutch control over the Gold Coast, but the lucrative slave trade would soon lure the British back. The British soon returned, and using their deceptive ways were able to take full control of the Gold Coast and were allowed to do whatever they pleased with the land. However, the indigenous tribe, the Ashanti, had different ideas about who would be in control. Due to the massive profits in slave trade, the Ashanti people were able to fight back against the British. As the British took control of the Gold Coast, they moved into the interior to control slave trade from the Ashanti. They were concerned that the Ashanti people were supplying slaves to other European countries, and the British didn't want that to happen. They moved in to take control, but were met by the strong Ashanti people. The British underestimated the Ashanti and had no idea they had an extant supply of weapons and supplies. This allowed the Ashanti to defeat the opposing British forces. The British regrouped and organized a second attack. At the end of 2 years, they were able to defeat the Ashanti. But the Ashanti people would not sign any agreements with the British. Due to this, the British government decided that it wasn't worth the money and time to take over the Gold Coast and withdrew from the country altogether.
The British at first attempted to seize control of Uganda by putting forth treaties that promised protection from other countries looking for more land in other African tribes. However, the treaties were in essence contracts that gave away land and other natural resources to the British, with the Ugandans being blissfully unaware of what they were giving up. As soon as the treaties were signed, the British moved in armies to treacherously subdue them and colonize their lands. Britain then allied itself with certain Ugandans with the intent of using them for forced labor and for its armies. Most of the forced labor was to harvest cotton for the textile mills back in Britain. Britain ruled the lands by using paid Ugandan mercenaries to enforce the peace, ensuring that casualties would not include a drop of British blood when the Ugandans tried to resist with violence.
During the 1500s, the demand for slaves in the Americas greatly increased, making trade in slaves overshadow gold as the principal export of the area. For almost 150 years, Ghana was the center for British slave trade. Western traders arrived with ships full of manufactured goods to barter or trade for slaves. It is estimated that about 10 million slaves were transported, at rates of up to 100,000 slaves each year. In 1807, the importation of slaves into America was made illegal. In the same year, Britain used its naval power and its diplomatic muscle to outlaw slave trade by its citizens and to begin a campaign to stop the international trade in slaves. However, these efforts were not successful until the 1860s because of the continued demand for plantation labor in the New World. There were many positive effects that resulted from imperialism in the Gold Coast. British control brought about some political stability and order in the area. Their efforts to improve the country resulted in improved sanitation and education. All of the hospitals, schools, and factories that were built created more jobs for the people of the Gold Coast. Literacy rates rose, and the average life expectancy increased. And order and peace was finally brought to them. The amount of local warfare was greatly reduced due to control of the government. Economic expansion occurred and African products became available to the international market, allowing for them to become prosperous. Just like there are many positive effects that came from imperialism, there were also negative effects. Perhaps one of the worst being that the natives lost control of their land and independence, and they were placed under the indirect rule of the British. Homes and property were transferred to the authority of the British, and the natives had little to no say in it. Oftentimes, the people of the Gold Coast fought the British in battle in order to defend their way of life. The natives' culture was replaced by the European culture through the educational system. This caused traditions and customs to become broken down. Many people were lost resisting the Europeans, and others died of new diseases such as smallpox that were brought over by the British. This was because the natives had no immunity to these diseases. Also, famine spread around after the demand of cash crops caused a shortage of food. On top of all of that, men were forced to leave their villages to support themselves and their family, because all of the high-paying jobs were filled by the British. Overall, imperialism created conflicting ideas about society and a person's worth. People no longer saw themselves as equal, but many new advancements and regulations were put in place for the natives.
As much as European imperialism in Africa hurt the African continent, it also helped it in many ways. There are many benefits that the Africans derived from the colonization of their lands. Warfare among local tribes and people has been reduced because of European control. Since the European military was there to keep order, the number of attacks and raids among tribes has been greatly reduced. The Europeans also improved the sanitation in Africa and brought schools and hospitals to the Africans. This resulted in the literacy rate and life expectancy in the area being brought up significantly. Europe also helped the Africans economically. They built railroads and roads in Africa which improved travel and trade within the continent. They also gave the Africans dams, telegraphs, firearms, and other technological advancements. Imperialism in Africa has had a huge impact on the modern world today. European cultures has influenced Africa very much. This results in the destruction of many native cultures and the spread of European ones. In Africa, European languages has spread through the whole continent. Languages French, German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, and English are commonly known in Africa. The Europeans also took many resources from the African continent and leaving very little for the natives. This results in the African countries today being poorly developed and poverty. As the Europeans took over Africa, many people were forced into labor. This continues today as corporate colonization. Big corporations such as Nike or Abercrombie use African laborers to make their products that are then shipped to the United States and other developed countries for consumption.